the United Nations Summit of the Future. Tackling urgent challenges. Conflict. A climate crisis. Poverty. Hunger. Inequality. The technology revolution and global governance. What's ahead as the UN plans for the future? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and welcome to a CGTN America special program, Summit of the Future. As leaders from around the globe gather at the United Nations in New York for this year's General Assembly, a major focus is on the future of the world body. The UN's Summit of the Future was convened to look at how to map a new way forward for the decades-old institution. But will there be greater international consensus on tackling some of the world's biggest challenges? Coming up, you will hear from some prominent UN officials as they discuss major global issues of our times. And as the UN looks ahead, it's also taking stock of how it's evolved over the years and why it now needs reform. As World War II came to an end, the United Nations was established in 1945.
My honor and my privilege in the chair to carry a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
Maintaining peace and security were critical objectives of the new international organization. Nearly 79 years on, the world has changed significantly and the UN has changed too.
I give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
It currently has 193 member states. In 1971, the People's Republic of China assumed its place as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. China is now a major global power and plays a significant role at the United Nations. Demographics have continued to shift and the global south is on the rise as developing countries make rapid economic progress. Today, former colonies of Western powers are independent nations demanding a greater voice as UN member states. Still, Africa, with a population of about 1.5 billion people, has no permanent member seat on the Security Council. But now, it wants two places. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres acknowledges the need for change, reform and more global cooperation, and he pushed for a UN Summit of the Future, encouraging world leaders to map a new way forward to better tackle the urgent problems of the 21st century.
We have a chance to shape multilateralism for years to come. And indeed, our world badly needs reform of the Security Council, reform of the international financial system, the meaningful engagement of youth in decision-making.
But with conflicts raging and escalating geopolitical tensions, the ongoing challenge for the UN is to be more effective in addressing global peace and security. The high-level summit may also accelerate action on some of the world's other leading problems, the climate crisis, ending hunger, and reducing inequality. These issues are already part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals for 2030 that are severely off track. Meanwhile, in this era of technological revolution, the UN Secretary-General sees opportunities and challenges.
Technology must reduce inequalities, not reproduce them, or pit people against each other. AI will affect all of humankind, so we need a universal approach to deal with it.
So how much will this summit matter? Could it be a turning point that delivers new energy and resolve to an old institution for future generations? For more now on the importance of the Summit of the Future and its ambition, let's hear from UN Under-Secretary-General for Policy, Guy Bernard Ryder. Guy, thanks so much for joining us. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, he's characterized the Summit of the Future as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reinvigorate global action. Why does the Secretary General think that we've got to a point now, something of an inflection point, where the UN has to reflect and then look at what its future role is going to be, how it operates as well?
Yeah, I think there are two things behind this high level of ambition and indeed the high level of need for this summit. The first is that the world, as we all know only too well, is facing an extraordinary array of global challenges, from these conflicts which we don't seem to be able to resolve, to climate change, to stalled development processes, and as much else. And we know that we need to do better in responding effectively to these global challenges, and that's one part of the summit's challenge. The other thing is that as the United Nations approaches its 80th birthday, we're still operating to a great extent with the machinery that was put in place 80 years ago. And as the Secretary General likes to say, we can't solve the problems of our grandchildren with the machinery built by our grandparents. We have to update, we have to modernize, we have to make our governance processes reflect the realities of today, and to be effective and to be fair.
Right, and the Secretary General has stressed the importance of more global cooperation, more consensus. If we look at the role that China has been playing, China has been a strong advocate for more dialogue, more cooperation and multilateralism. And as you point out, at a time of considerable global tension, how key is the multilateral approach if we are to improve the prospects for peace and security?
Yeah, there's something of a sort of a paradox at play here. We know there are major divisions in the world, differences of view, differences of interest, a great deal of conflict. But it's precisely because of those rather difficult circumstances that multilateralism, even if it's difficult to practice effectively, becomes all the more important, because the only way to get over these divisions, to find common purpose, is to reinvest in multilateralism. So some would say this summit comes at a most difficult moment. Why do it at this most difficult moment? Well, it's precisely because our circumstances are problematic that this summit becomes all the more important. And the appeal of the Secretary General, he's just reiterated it, is for all member states to make this effort, and yes, it's a compromise on all sides, come together and discover common purpose for the future of multilateralism. It's a challenge of our moment.
Right, the United Nations already has a very ambitious agenda. Its Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, SDGs as they're known. I mean, the plan is to tackle major areas like poverty elimination, zero hunger, providing quality healthcare, education, among other things. But as we are aware, the SDG targets are way off track right now. How can this summit give new impetus to getting those targets back on track?
Yes, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, this 2030 agenda, remain as important as ever. And the bad news is that we are behind, we are off track in delivering on the SDGs. And the summit doesn't change those goals in any way. The SDGs are what we need to do. Our Summit of the Future is designed to address the how we do it, to have our machinery updated, made more effective to deliver on the SDGs. So our summit will be looking at how we can make the world of finance, the international financial architecture, better support the SDGs, how we can govern technology to help deliver sustainable development, how we can put in place new initiatives to deal with peace and security, because when you have conflict and fragility in societies, sustainable development becomes a very distant proposition. So we are addressing at the Summit of the Future the how of delivering on the SDGs. These are two complementary efforts.
As you pointed out a moment ago, dealing with the climate crisis, it's one of the major challenges for the global community. It's a critical global challenge. Secretary General Guterres has been very outspoken on the need for urgent action. Can this summit deliver more cooperation to tackle what is the crisis of our times?
Well, indeed, and as you say, Secretary General Guterres has been very outspoken in respect of doing better on tackling climate change. Let's bear in mind that the Summit of the Future meets just a few weeks before COP29. The dedicated climate negotiations will take place in Baku. So we're not trying to do the job of COP29, but we are trying to set the stage. We are trying to make sure that basic commitments, and a lot of this again revolves around financing mitigation and adaptation efforts on climate change, that we're preparing the path towards COP29 in Azerbaijan in November.
Guy Bernard Ryder, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The world is becoming increasingly urbanized. That means an even greater challenge for the UN to deliver on its Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. To address the issue and her hopes for the Summit of the Future, I talked with the Executive Director of UN Habitat, Ana Claudia Rosbach. Ana Claudia, thanks so much for being with us. United Nations Habitat is mandated by the UN General Assembly to promote socially and environmentally sustainable towns and cities. Now that is a massive undertaking. How many countries work with UN Habitat? And what do you see as the major challenges as the UN plans for its future?
Yeah, indeed, and it's a major task. We are responsible to the areas related to urbanization, human settlements, and the world is increasingly urbanizing. So the forecast is that around 2050, we're going to have 70% of the population living in cities. So this means, for example, in Africa, 6 million more people, so doubling the current urban population. Right now, cities are growing more in territory than in population. So we face challenges, for example, related to urban sprawl. Cities are growing and overtaking precious land that should be dedicated, that could be dedicated to rural activities, agriculture, environmentally protected areas. So this is a major challenge that we have to deal with, right? This goes vis-a-vis this urbanization process, big influx of people coming into cities within a major frame of a global housing crisis that has different features. We have homelessness in several countries. We have affordability gaps in almost all countries. We have people living in informal settlements, especially in the global south. We're talking about 1 billion people living in informal settlements. We have houses being lost due to conflicts, wars, disasters, nature-made. So the complexity is very high. We have to deal with growing, expanding cities, but we need to pay attention on how we grow, how we expand. Land is precious. We have all the climate challenges, food security challenges, and we are facing a global housing crisis.
Right now, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he has stressed the importance of the Summit of the Future and the hope that the summit will give some impetus to meeting the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, as it's sometimes called. I mean, how important is the summit for UN Habitat?
Oh, the Summit of the Future is crucial for all UN agencies and for us too. We have been very active, engaged with the SDGs, of course, localizing the SDGs. We have a whole set of work supporting local governments, local and regional governments in accelerating the implementation of the SDGs. There's a big intersection between the Sustainable Development Goals and the New Urban Agenda, which is the global commitment that sustains the mandate of UN Habitat.
Now, China has worked very closely with UN Habitat to promote housing, to promote sustainable urbanization. In fact, you've cooperated in areas like smart cities and rural revitalization. I mean, how important is the China-UN Habitat relationship?
Yeah, it's very important. We have been working in China for decades, actually, and our relationship has deepened, actually, and expanded, not only in China, but globally. So China is a partner for our global actions. For example, China supports us in our work supporting the regional office in Bangkok. with China, we work also with the World Cities Day. We celebrate with China every year the World Cities Day. China has been a stronger sponsor of UN Habitat as well, with earmarked and non-earmarked contributions. Yeah, and we hope that this alliance and this collaboration keep going in the future.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Anna.
UN Women is an organization dedicated to fighting for gender equality. It wants to ensure greater empowerment and potential for women and girls. I addressed that issue at the Summit of the Future with the Deputy Executive Director for UN Women, Enyadradzai Gombolzwanda. Enyadradzai, thanks so much for being with us. I want to start with a big challenge for UN Women, and that is gender inequality. Of course, addressing this inequality is one of the major aims of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, as the Summit of the Future looks ahead, as the UN plans for its future, how much of a concern is ongoing gender inequality, and how can it be addressed effectively?
Thank you so much. Indeed, gender inequalities is a huge concern for UN Women. We've just launched our gender snapshot report, which gives the data on the situation of women and girls around the world and the inequalities. And within it is clearly issues that we are deeply concerned about, the issues around poverty. Of course, we see a little bit of a reduction of extreme poverty. But the overall situation is dismal. We continue to see the importance of investing in food securities and food systems and increasing the wages for women, and especially productivity for women farmers. And investing in the care sector is also a critical issue that is at the center of showing the inequalities and the gender inequalities within our societies. And therefore, our data is also showing that it's very important for us to invest in creating an infrastructure of decent jobs and possibilities of 300 million new decent and low carbon jobs would really move the envelope, would really tilt SDG 5. So what we are seeing with the Summit for the Future in the UN General Assembly is a recommitment to a very strong agenda for advancing gender equality. And of course, this year we know that it's very historic, with some of the biggest elections happening in recent history. We know 107 countries would be going into elections, and this is how definitely we can increase the number of women in decision making.
Right, you mentioned some of the big challenges there, the provision of healthcare being one of them, eliminating poverty, eradicating hunger, the economic empowerment of women. I want to talk about education. Of course, that's another big challenge, especially for young girls in many, many countries around the world. Can you give us a sense of how big this challenge is and about the prospects for the future?
Education is at the foundation of fighting inequalities and reducing gender inequalities. It remains, we still have not achieved the progress that we want to see around this issue, and it's manifested not only in terms of access, but also issues of transition from primary education, and the girls especially have limited opportunities. And we see this also manifested in other indicators, for instance, relating to child marriage, that we know remains a critical area of concern. And if no progress is made at the moment, and accelerated progress at the current rate, it may take us another almost 300 years to end child marriage. And this is very, very depressing. But at the same time, we are hopeful because we also see a very strong commitment in the drafts of the Pact for the Future to issues of education and to the issues around young people.
What about sexual violence and the exploitation of women? I mean, we know that in many cases, women are also the victims of human traffickers around the world. I mean, how hopeful are you that there will be global action, there will be cooperation to try and tackle these challenges?
Sexual violence breaks our heart. It's dehumanizing. There has been it's clear that violence against women's bodies and this sexual violence is part of the architecture of the embedded patriarchy in our societies. And you raise the issue of trafficking or human trafficking for women and girls. This is a critical issue. And we feel that as UN Women, we have for years since the conference 30 years ago in Beijing, 29 years ago, 30 years next year, there was a clear commitment to the issues of violence against women and the points that we are raising around trafficking. And out of it was the establishment of the Violence Against Women Trust Fund. But what we are seeing is that there is not sufficient efforts to really arrest and respond to the transnational crimes against women. Human trafficking is a transnational crime, and we see it every day where there is huge mobility of persons. We are following closely the situation in the Darien region in the Latin America. We are following closely the situation that happens in East Africa and going into the Middle East. And these are issues that we are really concerned about, and we are very encouraged, at least, that there is a commitment to issues of violence against women in the Pact for the Future. And we hope that member states will accompany this with resources to implement and to address both from the prevention but also from the response. And ultimately, it's around impunity that is critical to ensure that there is no impunity to violence against women and to gender-based violence, including in crisis situations and in humanitarian situations.
Thank you so much for joining us. As the UN takes on the challenges of an increasingly changing world, it's also addressing issues like reform of global governance and financing, two themes at the Summit of the Future. Let's hear now from David Passarelli. He is the director of the UN University Center for Policy Research. David, thanks so much for being with us. You have a great deal of experience on the issue of multilateralism, and your center has quite a network both inside and outside the United Nations. I mean, if we look at the world right now and the challenges that the world is facing, how important is the multilateral approach if we are to meet some of those goals set by the Summit of the Future?
Thank you so much for having me on the program. It is indispensable. I think what has emerged over the last 3 years is a real appreciation that we are only as strong as our weakest link. And that is going to require an investment by the international community to come together to address global challenges. It can't be done alone. It can't be done in small coalitions. We need to have an understanding that is broad, shared, and that can direct political will and investments towards global challenges. And more than my opinion, I think what's important is that almost 4 years ago to the day, the member states of the United Nations on the 75th anniversary of the organization issued a statement that recognized how important multilateralism is and committed to investing more and doing more to support the multilateral system.
Now, your research focuses a great deal on things like global governance and global finance. These are two of the major themes of the Summit of the Future. And if we look at the United Nations was formed in 1945. It was created then in the aftermath of World War II. Is it time now for there to be a major reform of this international institution to meet the demands of today, to meet the needs of people, especially those people who are in the developing world?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the Secretary General has been a forceful advocate for reform, but he's been joined by other leaders within the United Nations family. Leaders of the IMF and the World Bank have just recently, just a few months ago, launched a new review process to understand how those organizations can be retooled to better deliver the finance that the international community needs, but particularly the global south. It's very difficult to expect countries that are struggling to deliver basic needs to focus on future and emerging priorities if there is a shortage of decent work, if it is impossible to feed families within those countries. And so I think it's quite important to be sensitive to the demands that they're making, and the demands that they're making are in part a greater voice in international organizations in order to ensure that the work of those organizations and the finance that they deliver is more closely connected to the challenges that they face. I think there's widespread agreement that this is an important moment of change, the time is now, and that we have to be bold and ambitious in our proposals and muster that political will to get over the line and to drive forward some of these ambitious reforms.
Right, and speaking of change, I mean, if we look at some of the changes taking place right now, let's look at technology, for instance. There are rapid advances in things like artificial intelligence. But at the same time, there are also concerns that as this technology grows and becomes more advanced, that it could create a digital divide. It could leave some people behind. How do we make sure that nobody's left behind?
Yes, it's one of the principal, I think, points of contention over the last few years. How to close a number of gaps, an infrastructure gap, a finance gap, a capacity gap, to make sure that AI and its possibilities are really shared across the international community. And the Secretary General has brought together a high-level advisory board on artificial intelligence to understand how that particular technology can be governed, but also how we can build this necessary scaffolding under the AI frameworks to make sure that we are having diverse participation in this space. It goes also to other issues. We have seen an increasing interest in regulating data, cross-border data flows, how we collect data, analyze data, and share data. And there as well, I think the international community is making a significant push to join up efforts to make sure that we are on the same page with respect to data, which is such an important driver for economic development, and where so many developing countries have a strong interest in seeing a harmonized approach to data governance.
David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, as we continue our conversation on the UN's Summit of the Future, we turn now to a distinguished panel of experts. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute, and he's chairman of Asian Narratives. With us too is David Monnier. He heads the University of Johannesburg Center for Africa-China Studies. And Jorge Heine joins us from Boston. He is a former Chilean ambassador to China. Welcome to all of you. Einar, the United Nations Summit of the Future has put an emphasis on the importance of multilateralism and building trust. As we look at the major challenges that the world is facing today, how critical is international cooperation and the multilateral approach that China has advocated very strongly?
Well, obviously, it's critical when you're looking at global issues like the economy, climate change, the impact of digitalization. You know, there has to be a decision made between competition or cooperation. China has been on the side of cooperation and consensus. The U.S. has seen the world as a competition, which it needs to win.
David Monnier, reform and global governance are also of critical importance at this Summit of the Future. I mean, if we look at the continent of Africa, it was a very different place, of course, when the United Nations was formed in 1945. Africa is now looking at getting 2 seats on the United Nations Security Council. How big a role can African nations play as the United Nations moves ahead, moves forward, and with the kinds of reform that it's talking about?
I think there are a lot of opportunities as well as challenge for Africa. As it stands, it appears that some big powers, particularly the United States, is suggesting 2 seats for Africa, but with no veto power. So that questioned the whole question of bringing in Africans as non-equals in the House and for legitimize a post-1945 world order. But what Africans really want, it's equality, dealing with issues of injustice of the past, and given the fact that the bulk of countries within the United Nations General Assembly are Africans, they need a say, and some of the major decisions, such as peacekeeping, and the bulk of peacekeeping is taking place on the continent. However, at the top of decision making, the decisions are made without Africans in the house, so in the room, and that is a problem. And therefore, one hopes the discussions taking place throughout this session, there will be an understanding and the view of democratizing the system and opening up for all.
Ambassador Heine, Latin America, of course, has also changed in very big ways since the United Nations was founded in 1945. We look at Brazil, we look at Chile right now. These are major economies in Latin America. I mean, looking ahead, what kind of role do you see Latin America play at the UN?
Well, I will say this. When the United Nations was established in 1945, 20 of the 51 founding states were from Latin America. And so Latin America played an important role in those years in the drafting of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration in a variety of other ways. And of course, Latin America doesn't have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council either, much like Africa. And there's something a bit odd about, Western Europe having 2 seats among the P5, and neither Africa nor Latin America having representation there. So that's been a source of, discontent for a long while. Brazil, of course, has been making a case for that for quite some time. Brazil, of course, opens the speeches of the heads of state by tradition, and it seems to me we're going to hear more about that. Now, so Latin America has a long tradition of believing in multilateralism, of supporting UN work, of supporting international law, and we would like to continue to work with the UN in that sense. But it is important also to reform the UN, to adapt it to the realities of the new century. And hopefully something along those lines will come out of this Summit of the Future.
I know this summit is also about the future of global development and increased commitment to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda. Of course, as we are all aware, these goals are now seriously off track. How do you see China's Global Development Initiative advance the goals of the SDG?
Well, there's the irony is that China has been pushing for values. I mean, and no one is going to argue that every country needs to be respected. They have their own path to development, and they have to be secure. This idea that somehow you can settle the world's problems by giving more countries a veto power, I think is incorrect. I think the way that China has approached this is through consensus, trying to understand other countries, what their needs are, also telling them how China fits into it, and then actually doing. I mean, right now, the problem is the UN has not been able to force the kind of change that the majority want, whether it's in Gaza or on climate change or so many other areas, because you do have this lopsided governance where the P5 can weigh in at any time. Now, China's part of that. But if there was a broad-based movement to change it in favor of something that's consensually based, that takes cooperation as the necessary element, I think China would be in favor.
David, when it comes to delivering on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, as Ina mentioned, tackling critical issues like the climate crisis, financing has always been a sticking point. Can the United Nations be more effective in this area in the years ahead to secure financing, to make sure that it's used in the right way to advance these goals?
It could on paper, but in reality, and the lessons we have learned since 1945 is that at times those with resources tend to smuggle in their own agendas, their own model of development, their own democratic way of governance, at the expense of local culture, a sense of a collective governance and the way of life, particularly on the African continent, in Latin America, and other areas. There are so many ways of governing without having this kind of universal or one system fit all, where certain institutions of UN are abused in favor of the most powerful countries in the world, and agencies, your Bretton Woods institutions that are supposed to deal with reconstruction and development, they end up advancing liberal democracy, as was the case in the 80s and 90s, the destruction of African economies through economic structural adjustment pushed by United States and Western powers, using these agencies for the worst outcomes that we've seen in the post-pandemic COVID-19.
All right, David, do you get the sense that there has been a failure among major countries, especially the former colonial powers, to recognize that the nations of the world now are a very disparate group with different cultures, different goals, and sometimes, all these things have to be pulled together?
Indeed, I think what we are seeing is that the notion that modernization should and must be also followed by westernization. And that's where the danger is. I think what we need, all of us in the world, it's modernization, however anchored modernization in our own culture, in our own civilization, in our own ways of life, and contribute to the betterment of our regions as well as of everyone in the world. And therefore, this has been a major challenge in terms of the kind of models advanced by the most developed countries, particularly in the Western world.
Ambassador Heine, the Summit of the Future has also put a focus on technology innovation and digital cooperation, especially in areas like artificial intelligence. I mean, can the United Nations play a more effective role in global regulation of these technologies?
I think it can. We've talked so much about the huge economic and political crisis that the world lives in right now. The term that has been used is a polycrisis. Now, if you think about what artificial intelligence can do, if it is mishandled on top of all those crises, we will realize then we will really be in dire straits. So it seems to me it is very important to establish some sort of regulatory framework. We have, the example of the internet, which isn't really properly internationally regulated. The system that exists to regulate the internet is very imperfect and has all sorts of deficiencies. So it seems to me there's a lesson there. Now that we move from the internet to this other major technological breakthrough, I hope we can come up with some sort of, good regulatory system body that is able to avoid the inherent dangers of AI going astray.
I know the United Nations grew after the Second World War, and its central focus at the time was on peace and security. I mean, if we look at the world today, it's still struggling with conflict. It's still struggling with geopolitical tensions, which we see on the rise all the time. Can the UN be more effective in the future when it comes to these crucial challenges, and also, the things like peacekeeping and development at the same time?
Yeah, but it's obviously, the fact that we're having this discussion, and my colleagues have brought up these issues, is there is this feeling that the UN is not, it's vital, but it's not on the right track. It needs an overhaul in governance. Obviously, the Security Council is the main focus. But all of the things that we're talking about, all the public goods that could be achieved, take cooperation. And right now, there are countries within the UN who just do not believe in cooperation. They think it's some sort of game, and that's what I alluded to when I first started out. A multipolarity, it sounds great, but it's not an answer. It could be a path to chaos, where countries don't agree and nothing gets done, or it could be a path to cooperation through consensus. And you have to have a body that supports that. And that, I think, is the crucial issue. as they face the summit? Is there a willingness to change in order to manage the future?
David, when the United Nations was founded in 1945, there were just a handful of African nations that were represented at the founding of the UN. Of course, now Africa is a continent of independent nations with a combined population of 1.5 billion people. It was also a time when the world was seen in a very different way, and it was largely along ideological lines. There was us and there was them. How does Africa now overcome that?
I think working with the rest of the world closely through a number of forums and bodies such as the Non-Alignment Movement, the Group of 77 plus China, working through BRICS, also working through other forums in bringing a consensus on key issues. Yes, the reforms of United Nations Security Council is central, but that is not sufficient. I agree with my colleagues. We also need to, the language that is used is important. The norms and values that underpins this body is also equally important. Resources in dealing with this. And at the heart of it, to address the issues of injustice of the past and ensure that Africans in their big number, 1.5 billion, will sit on the table as equals. The idea that you bring only two and have Africans in the room just for photo shoots, it's an unacceptable way, or even the concentration of just bringing the African Union. There are no decisions that are taken at the African Union. So sovereign powers, sovereign nations still determine what's happening in our world. And therefore, we would want to see Africans being given equality, and that in itself will bring confidence to the entire system, the democratization, as well as human rights issues.
Ambassador Heine, this summit is also about responsibility to future generations with a much greater emphasis on engaging young people as the UN plans ahead. I mean, how critical is that?
Well, it is absolutely critical. You know, and this year, for example, we are going to have elections, major elections in so many countries around the world. And in many countries, we see that young people are very disaffected. They are alienated. They consider that the political system is not responding to their needs, to their wants, to their necessities. So in that sense, obviously, that is the future. And unless, it seems to me, we do something about that, things are going to get worse politically around the world before they get better. Let me also emphasize something on your earlier point, Tanan, and that has to do with this. In today's globalized, interdependent world, connectivity is of the essence. And it seems to me one of the advantages that China has brought to the table in this debate is, on the one hand, emphasizing the importance of physical connectivity, that is physical infrastructure, which it has done through, the Belt and Road Initiative, but also of digital connectivity, going back to your earlier point, and today, that is so significant. I think it's something like 5.4 billion people now that are now on the internet, but obviously it's 8 billion people that are on the world. Ideally, we want to have, if not all, at least as many people as possible connected. And there, digital connectivity, submarine cables, having more people on the internet is so important if we want to bring economic growth, progress to everybody.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, Ina Tangen, David Money, thanks for joining us. From multilateralism to greater commitment on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, global governance, and how to manage the digital revolution, the UN's Summit of the Future has focused attention on several critical issues. I hope you have enjoyed this CGTN America special program. It's been engaging and informative. Thanks for watching.